Good afternoon, beautiful people. And in this room sits beauty like I've really never seen before as we look at the community members, the supporters, and the allies for our women, our children, and our families in this community. I am so honored to be here today to be part of such an amazing event and to support the work of an organization that I believe in so strongly, Open Arms. I'm so inspired by the words that Dila spoke, and now our award winner, speaking about how we must be there to care for our community members, to wrap them in love and support as they experience what is going on in this country nationally. I recently just came from Washington, D.C. I've spent the last couple of days there. And as many of you know, and has been already said up here on this stage, for many people in our community, these are uncertain and scary and frightening times. What can feel like unsurmountable fear has descended upon our community members, those that are most vulnerable and the most marginalized within our community. Their access, our access, to healthcare, services, freedom of movement, justice, dignity, and basic respect is at risk. Yet in the face of all of that, you all sit here today. And as we just heard, Open Arms is always going to be here to embrace new and expecting parents with compassion, encouragement, education, and culturally sensitive support so families succeed and children thrive. And I know that because I took that off their website. If I wasn't standing here today in front of all of you, I'd be sitting at that table over there with my colleagues, my friends, my loved ones, the women of the Native Americans Dialogue on Infant Mortality. And when you hear that name, you should think, why do we have to have a collective called the Native American Women's Dialogue on Infant Mortality? We exist, and we are so blessed to be work with Open Arms closely. It's how I became involved in the organization as Open Arms acts as our fiscal sponsor. But we exist like why Open Arms exists, because in this county, King County, the land you stand on today, the land of the Coast Salish people, the first peoples of this area, our babies, our Native American babies, our African American babies are 2 and 3 times more likely to die in their first year. And with those deaths come an unsurmountable amount of grieving, hurt, trauma, and pain amongst our communities. These organizations exist because it's women like me who experience racism, prejudice, and discrimination in the healthcare system and in all the systems that we encounter as a result of the institutional and structural racism in which this country is built. It's because of the actions that we are currently seeing openly at the national level. But I want to tell you one thing. These actions are not new to me. To some of you, they may have been a surprise. But for people of color, for indigenous people, this is not new to us. This has been happening in this country that was founded on the genocide of my ancestors, of those that came before me. I identify as an indigenous woman. On my father's side, I'm a member of the Pawnee Nation. We were originally located in Nebraska and Kansas and moved into the Oklahoma territories. In the space of 100 years, 92% of my people died. By the census in 1910, there was only 633 Pawnees left living in the Pawnee Agency in Oklahoma. But yet I stand here today. I stand here as my ancestors' greatest hope. I am a tangible manifestation of their resiliency. My sister Colleen Ekowak, who's sitting right there, the executive director of the Chief Seattle Club, she recently spoke at the Seattle Women's March, and she said something that I think about every single day. She sat in front of that crowd representing the indigenous first peoples of this land. She said, "We have been here before, and we are not afraid." Today, I want to talk to you about resiliency. And for Indigenous communities, and I know for so many other communities, our resiliency is grounded in the strength of our grandmothers, of those who have come before us and sustained us. And in our communities, women are considered to be the sacred life bearers of the community. We are the backbones of our communities. And when you think about resiliency, and I looked it up last night, and according to Webster's dictionary, it's defined as a noun, as a thing. I don't see resiliency as a noun. And how we're going to talk about resiliency today is we're going to talk about it as a verb, because resiliency is action. I'm going to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story, and as Native people, we are people of story. And we come from a tradition of learning from those stories. And this is a story that I was told of the grass dancers. If you ever go to a powwow, they're the most beautiful. I always think they're most beautiful. They start out the powwows. And this is a story from my community. How did grass dancers come to be? Why do we have grass dancers? In my community, we would go forward and we would follow the buffalo. And we would go into fields, and if you've ever been in Kansas and Nebraska, you can go to fields where grass is this high. It's 6 feet high. And the men would go before us, and they would create a space for the women to come and establish the camps. And the young men would go, and they would learn from the older men who taught them, the elders in the community, who taught them how to stomp down the grass. They went before us, and they stomped down the grass, and they found a space for us, a sacred space that was safe, that had water, that allowed us to go and to hunt. And that was a sacred place for the women and children to come into. And these young men would go out and they would stomp down this grass. And with every step came a prayer for the people, for the safety, for the protection, for looking forward into those next generations. They would stomp down that grass, step by step by step. When they did this, it took several things, because that grass was high. It's not the most fun. It is hot in Nebraska. They had to go with passion. They went with dedication. And at some points, they were putting up camps to protect us, whether it be from our enemies or from other animals or predators that may exist. And sometimes they did it with anger. And they used that anger not towards bitterness, because anger can be a healthy emotion. They use that anger, that passion, that determination to create a sacred space for our people to be. Today, we honor and talk about those who go before to create a sacred space for women and for the children that they are birthing. And I think about my grandmother, whose picture you see there. My grandmother birthed 14 children and adopted 6, my mother being one. None of these children were birthed in a hospital system. She was birthed with traditional midwives and doulas. Out of those 20 children, there was a point in this country's history where they decided that Indigenous people, that we did not deserve and we were not able to raise our own children. And they took 9 of my grandmother's children, the youngest being 5 years old. And the only reason they took those children is because we were Native. Because they did not respect our culture, our tradition, our way of knowing. And I think of my grandmother and the agony she must have felt when they ripped those children from her arms. They placed them in these boarding schools across the United States, and the government attempted to kill all that was indigenous in them. They actually had a motto. It was kill the Indian and save the man. Despite all of this, I was raised with a grandmother who never let her fall, who never fell into hate and to bitterness. She exemplified the words from my favorite Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, where he said, "Don't allow anybody to pull you so low as to make you hate them. Don't allow anybody to make you lose your self-respect to the point that you do not struggle for justice. You have the responsibility to seek a life that is better for everybody. You must be involved in the struggle for freedom and for justice." My grandmother, matriarch of Mentasta Village, Alaska, Katie John, whose face you see today, she danced out her resilience. She stomped down the grass. She created a sacred space and built a school so her children came back. My Uncle Fred John, he tells us the story of when he came back home after 3 years of not seeing his family. And he says what he remembers is he saw my grandmother as they brought in the bus with open arms reached out to encompass them and to wrap them in love. Arms always open. Resiliency isn't about survival. Resiliency is about love. It's about building and supporting. In resiliency, we see the character of our community. Resiliency is not a noun, it is an action. Today, all of you sit with giants, doulas, midwives, outreach workers, providers in our healthcare system. They serve their community with compassion and humility. They are the descendants of their grandmothers. History striking back all the way to slave ships that brought them to this country. Indigenous peoples like me who were here first but faced genocide. Immigrant and refugees who faced discrimination and prejudice when they entered this country when they were striving for the best for their families. That is who you sit with today. They have dedicated their lives to service. These individuals follow in the footsteps of my grandmother, of their grandmothers, of all grandmothers. This legacy of resilience continues to teach us to strive for birth justice for all women. And I am going to tell you, it is not going to be easy. You will have to hear, recognize, and heal from the stories like I just told you. It is in that healing that change comes. It teaches us to take torn pieces, stitch them back together in bright, beautiful threads, rebuilding beauty, restoring culture, and breaking down the barriers that do not allow our families to experience the birth outcomes that they deserve. In the words of Beyonce, I've been waiting a long time to say this. As we strike out into our resiliency, we are finding beauty and healing where it did not live. In my community, this community, we do this out of love. Love for the next generations. We do this to build a great future for this country, for this state, for this county, for every single child that sits in this room today. And at our best, this will be done in reciprocal partnership with our community, with allies, with supporters to this cause. Together we will stand hand in hand, building, rebuilding, and with the communities leading us with strength, humility, passion, and determination. I'm going to tell you one more story about my grandmother. Not this grandmother, my father, his mother, Christabel Echohawk of Pawnee, Oklahoma. And I tell you the story of a woman that I never knew. Because like many people in our community, she died a death that was too soon, and that was preventable. And I think about my sister Colleen, who I already pointed out, who carries her name, Colleen Christabel. And as she carries that name, I see what the actions that my sister takes. She serves our community with love, compassion, and humility. She is the manifestation of the grandmother I never was able to know. She is the manifestation of her resilience. We all deserve to know our grandmothers, to know our babies, to see them live a full, healthy life that we all deserve. You all sit here today as an act of resilience and an act of resistance. Today, you are part of the story of the resilience of Open Arms. How can you contribute to stomping down the grass to clear the barriers that exist for our families, for our community? How are you preparing that sacred space for the next generations? And it's going to take bravery. You will have to challenge the status quo. You will have to challenge learnings and things that you thought you knew were right. It will take bravery. How big is your brave? What are the steps that you will take? Today, 14 years ago, I was in labor. It's my son's birthday today. As the days leading up to my son's birthdays, I tell them the story of their birth. And I tell them the ugly parts about it, the discrimination that I faced. I tell them the stories of when they were born and what their father was doing, and when their aunties arrived, and when their grandmother finally got there. And then I tell them the story of their auntie, my sister, Lael Ekawak, because I was blessed to have a doula. And she was my sister. And in the times when I thought that I could not breathe another breath, she was there, holding my hand. And when I faced discrimination, she's also a lawyer, she was in that hall and she challenged every single one of them to ensure that when my child was born, he was born into strength, he was born into love, he was born into compassion, and he was born into a community that will challenge and stand in a hallway and say, you will not treat my sister in this way. And that's what we do. We build community. We build family. And as I think about my son, and I woke him up this morning and told him where we were in his birth story. It's not his favorite thing. There is a song that comes from the Maori people of New Zealand, and our family is also a part of the Maori community. And I think about my son, and I know that as these next generations go forward, he is able to sing a song that I necessarily was not able to sing. I'm going to sing just a little bit of that song for you. And I ask you again, where are you in creating this sacred space? Where are you, and where will you stand? As our community calls for all of us to recognize that resiliency is not a noun, it is an action. And I can never be lost. I am a seed, born of greatness, descended from a line of chiefs. That's who I am. Thank you.